All right. So, like Dr. Root said, we're going to be talking a little bit about early weaning. Um, there are some major advantages and disadvantages to this process, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the in-depth process of the both the production effects, the and economic effects, both on multiple segments of the industry, and then we're going to talk about mitigating some of that risk associated with uh, early weaning going forward. So just to kind of define it, early weaning is that practice of weaning those calves at an earlier time point than normal production practices would dictate. Usually this is a resource or an economic based decision for a cow-calf producer. This year in particular, with drought, this is something that a lot of producers are looking at just because forage resources for the cow are not there, and we've seen hay prices go through the roof at this point. Just so maintaining that cow, maintaining that calf, and then trying to mitigate those production effects, the detrimental effects for next season, are really why a lot of producers are looking at early weaning. We know that lactation is that highest energy demand on that cow. So if she's lactating real heavy, she's got that calf on her, she's trying to go through uterine involution, maintain body condition score, and then we want her to rebreed. The likelihood of her doing that in this drought situation, and then the economic impact of that, are significant decision makers for us in this process. Now, the reality is we can actually wean a calf as early as 40 to 45 days. At that time point, that calf will actually start consuming larger amounts of forage. We can, feed that calf in a dry lot like we normally would in a feedlot situation, but there are some production and health ramifications to doing that. We do know that the weaning process is stressful for a calf. During that process, that's when we tend to see a lot of our calves getting sick. We see that increased incidence of morbidity. And the reality is, during that weaning process, we're going to see those calves kind of back off of feed a little bit, start to get a little depressed, and that's why we start seeing them getting sick. So that 45 day weaning period is we can do it, but for a production standpoint, is probably not the most optimal thing to be doing. Now, obviously, we're early weaning right now. It's a process that we're considering just because of the drought, hay prices, our cows' body condition scores going into breeding season this year were probably pretty poor. We had a really light winter, a really dry spring and summer. So that rebreeding process, we're probably supplementing quite a bit to get those cows back in condition for breeding. One of the things that we're probably looking at on the calf side, especially for early weaning, is we're actually going to be selling a calf that is a lot lighter than we normally would market that calf. We're also looking at the fact that there's multiple strategies to early weaning. But either way, we're probably looking at a decreased marketing weight. We're looking at an increased cost to maintain that calf in some instances, because the next phase of the production cycle, that feeder or even that stalker likes to see those calves preconditioned because they transition much better into that next phase and are much healthier. The other thing we need to look at from the calf side, and this is one option we're going to talk about, I think Ryan's going to talk about it a little bit, Dr. Larsen. There is a stress factor associated with not only weaning, but transport. And as we'll see in some certain scenarios, there is a strategy that exists where you wean that calf and you get them off your place immediately, and then that next guy in line's problem. So there's a stress factor associated with that as well. Now, the benefits of this really are to the cow. That cow, it's going to significantly decrease the nutrient demand on the cow because she's going to stop lactating. She's going to send those nutrients to focus on her maintenance or replenishment of her body, that uterine involution, and potentially that first trimester of pregnancy. Now, she's going to go into that next calving season, in theory, in a lot better body condition because she doesn't have that extended strain on her. We have more time to increase her body condition score. And, obviously she's going to be in a lot better shape because she's had to maintain a calf a lot shorter time. Now, this is where we kind of get into some of the effects on performance, though, when we talk about early feeding. Now, in theory, like I said, we can wean these calves early, and we can feed that calf to its genetic potential when forage quality and quantity is not optimal for the mother, meaning there's not a lot of forage out there for mom. So we're going to basically say we're going to pull that calf off. We're going to feed the calf, allow that mother to kind of maintain herself. Now, there is an increased cost of production associated with this. Feed the cheapest way to feed that calf is on the mom. So usually weaning to decrease, we're doing this early weaning process to decrease our production costs. So you can see how there's already a conflict there. If we're going to feed that calf and we're really worried about hay prices, now we've allotted more production costs to feeding that calf. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I think Dr. Larsen is going to talk about this, is, if you're going to maintain that calf, there's a cost associated with it, but it's a benefit from the production side, because there's going to be, if you're going to early wean, there needs to be a good nutrition and a good animal health program in place already. Now, this is where we kind of come into conflict with this process. We know that the cow-calf producers doing this from an economic and a resource standpoint. So it really benefits them in some instances to really decrease that cost of production. But that transition to that next phase of production into that feedlot or that stocker phase is there might be some issues, especially if there's that, I'm going to wean this calf now and just put them on a truck and get them off my place. So if their cost production is someone else's issue. Now, the first strategy is just wean the calves and transport. There's no investment in preconditioning at that point. You're going to see an increased incidence of sickness. That calf is not only going through that weaning process that's stressful, but now it's a transportation process. Now we're going to see they have to adapt to a new environment, new feed resource. They're being transported to an area where they're going to be commingled with other animals. So there's all these stressors associated with them. So we're probably going to see more than likely a decreased gain while adapting to this new environment, this new production system, this new feed, and while they're being treated to mitigate any of the sickness that's going on. Now, this early weaning process may not directly affect that cow-calf producer, because they're selling, more than likely they're just selling a lightweight calf. They're getting those production costs out of their system, but it might be detrimental to that next phase. And I think Dr. Larsen's actually going to talk about this now.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Garcia. Yeah, this puts us in a little conundrum when we're looking at this early weaning issue. There's not a simple answer when trying to analyze this. So we decided, just from the economic point of view, just to look at three different scenarios, because right, what's good for the cow-calf producer may not be good for the feedlot. So we're just going to take it from the cow-calf producer and then kind of think about that from a feedlot scenario. So I have two scenarios I want to talk about here. The first one is looking at 250 hay, which is maybe a little low right now, but let's look at 250. Assume that hay is priced at 250 a ton, and our three scenarios are maintain calf as normal, right? Get it up to normal weight, which I'm assuming is 550 pounds, sell it in the fall. Wean that calf early, get it off as quick as possible, then wean early, then precondition. So you got those three different scenarios. And the things I want to look at here is would be that first column is gross revenue, right? Just the total amount that you receive, and this is on a per head basis. So you can see, right, when we wean calf early, that's going to be a little different weight, right? I'm assuming with that wean early precondition, they're going to be on for another 45 days. So that's why that additional revenue is showing up. Also, we see that additional cost. Right. So what's interesting is when we wean that calf early, we're actually covering our variable costs. So if we wean them, get them out, let someone else worry about it, we're actually covering our variable costs. And none of the other scenarios are even, we're not covering our variable costs. Total costs, right? Total costs include variable and any of our fixed costs associated with asset ownership, depreciation, and whatnot. So when we look at this net return, so that's going to be gross revenue minus total cost, that wean calf early is our best choice, right? And on a year like this is something we've been saying for, right, on a year like this, our options may be what scenario is going to help us lose the least amount of money, right? We know hay is expensive, forage is our usual forage availability and on public resources is low. This is a year where we say, how can we lose the least amount of money? And so that wean calf early, from just a economic point of view, is the winner in this scenario, right? With that wean early preconditioned calves, which captures that increased cost, but also an increased weight. You're losing $90 a head, and then you maintain that calf as normal, assuming that you're going to feed it out, right? We're running out of resources. We're going to feed it out. You're going to lose $131 a head on that scenario. Now, if we go to that next slide, just changing that. Oh, so yeah, so this one it should say $300. Hey, I'm sorry, that's my fault. So this is assuming that $300 hay, right? So all we're doing, our revenue stays the same. We're just increasing those costs. So remember, before we were covering our variable costs with that wean calf early scenario, we're not covering our variable costs, and we're just bumping up how much we're losing. So still the winner is that wean calf early, but you can see that impact of those feed costs. Those feed costs are really going to have a detrimental impact because of the fact that, one, we're off our range early. We're having to feed additional alfalfa. Finding alfalfa is going to be tough. It's going to be expensive. And so in this scenario, producer has to be thinking, right, what's the way I can lose the least amount? Now, with that wean calf early, one thing that you don't want to do is damage relationship. If you are often selling calves to, if you have a feedlot that you have a good relationship with, this is something that you'd want to discuss with that feedlot and say, right, where can we come in? Maybe you do the precondition to maintain that relationship, that long term, because it may be good for this year, but you don't want to detrimentally impact next year and the year after that. So take that in mind as you think about, just because it may be the easiest, it may not be the optimal scenario. So just as I was thinking about this, I wanted to look. So this is Salina livestock auction. I wanted to look at just the historical pattern of prices as we go through this. So this is 300 to 400 pounds steers, 400 to 500, and 500 to 600. So you can see that there's a premium. There's the price premium that exists between that lighter weight to the head. So there's a trade-off there where you sell a little lighter but get a little higher price. And so you can see there's a few times in history, right? So in 18, right, you saw that lighter calf that was below. Some market condition impacted that, but on average, there is a premium. If we go to that next slide, this is just really looking at that premium. This is just the difference. So you can see in 2014, October 2014, that difference between that 300 to 400 pound steer and that 500 to 600 pound steer was almost $100. But on average, right, it's right around that $20 mark per hundredweight on those steers. So when you're thinking of this wean early, you got to remember that although it may be lighter, there is a price premium for selling that lighter calf. So take that into consideration as you're thinking about this. And this year, right, this year's the perfect storm of prices on both the feed side and we're seeing some cattle prices that are soft. And so you got to take into both sides into consideration as you're thinking about this.
So as Dr. Larsen and Garcia touched on, we talked about those three kind of different scenarios of you can maintain the calf all the way through normal production, early wean and precondition. And Dr. Larsen especially touched on the fact that perhaps early weaning with precondition isn't the optimal economic outcome for you as an individual producer, maybe, of the cow-calf. But if you're working on maintaining that relationship with the stalker or the feeder, it might be something to consider. And that's where kind of this portion of the presentation comes in. I'm going to talk about Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage insurance as a potential method of continuing risk management, maybe add a little revenue to our pocket and help that third scenario of preconditioning to help that scenario look a little better, maybe cover some of those additional variable and fixed costs. So this portion of the presentation I did want to mention is also supported through a grant through the USDA Western Extension Risk Management Education Center. So I'm not sure how many of you are all familiar with PRF Insurance, but it's a tool that we're trying to promote a little. Not that we have a vested interest, but that we do think it has potential to help producers. The idea behind it is to ensure your pastures, your rangelands, ensure that production for especially in times of drought. But the key thing to note here is that it's an index insurance and product, and it's an index based on rainfall. And so when the rain doesn't fall, that's when an indemnity is triggered. And so it's important to point out here that we're never measuring actual production. And so we're not insuring actual losses. So what you're insuring is rainfall, is when you're in a local area, and local here I have in parentheses, it's a grid system of 17 by 17 mile grids. And there's a tool on the USDA's website that any producer can go on, identify what grid their pastures and rangelands are in. Once they got that grid, then they can tie it back to the rainfall in that area, and they can insure the rainfall in that area. And when it falls below the coverage level that they've selected, that's when an indemnity is triggered. So the important thing here is that it's an index, and anytime we're with an index, there is potential for basis risk. And what we mean by that is that just because you experience an actual loss, production is down, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a payout, because again, we're insuring the rainfall, and the rain, while it does correlate okay with production, it's not perfect. And so there are going to be those times when we are susceptible to some amount of basis risk. So this slide here just shows the example of the grid locator tool on the USDA's website. And that's where we need to be pointing all producers to go. That's the first step, identifying what grid they belong to. You can click on any location and it'll pull it up and show the grid number you need. You need that 5-digit grid number, in this example, 22573 in Sevier County, Utah. Then the decisions the producer needs to make when they sit down with their insurance agent and discuss this, they really have 3 or 4 main decisions. That's the acreage, timing, and coverage level. Acres, they can insure any amount of acres up to the maximum owned or operated. You can insure both your owned land and as well as the different acreage you have permits for on public lands, Forest Service, and BLM. Timing, you have to insure at least 2 non-overlapping intervals. The intervals are each 2-month periods. So we'll look at that a little more as we get to our decision tool aid that I'm going to demonstrate. But that means each interval is 2 months, January, February, March, so on. You got to insure at least in 2 of those intervals. And then you select your coverage level. That's probably the most important decision to make, in terms of that determines at what point an indemnity is triggered. So you can select anywhere from 70 to 90% coverage. And so what it means is if the index or rainfall on average for that time period that you've selected coverage in is below, if you selected the 90% coverage level, if it falls below 90% of average rainfall, then an indemnity would be triggered and you'd get a payout. So I'm just going to jump quickly now to our decision tool aid that we've kind of developed as part of that grant, farmanalysis.usu.edu. And let me demonstrate quickly how we can use that tool. Okay, so as you pull it up, we have several tools here. Are you seeing the screen? All right,
I am. Yep.
Thanks, Gary. The one we're most interested here in for today is Pasture Rangeland Forage Insurance. You click on that, and then it's basically going through those same choices that I just demonstrated or walked us through. The first thing we're going to need is our state, our county. For this example, again, I'm using Sevier County. I picked a grid at 22574. And then those are these decisions that I walked us through, or go with the 90% coverage. The productivity factor has to do with every grid has a county base value that's been assigned by the RMA. And so a producer can choose what they feel their value is at relative to that county base value. So we'll leave that as 100%. We'll just put in 1,000 acres. And then again, selecting your at least two-month intervals of where you want coverage. I'm going to select May, June, October, November, and I'll walk you through how I arrived at which intervals I think would be good for this grid. Submit, and it brings us up a little summary. Okay, the main thing I want to walk us through to begin with, though, is clicking on this historical data tab. We scroll down, we have a lot of different charts that it pops up. The first has to do with that rainfall index. It's going to show us just in the past 10 years, what have our patterns of rainfall been. Obviously, when you have times of poor rainfall, those are times that you would expect more indemnities could be triggered versus when you've had times of above average rainfall. Down towards the bottom, though, this is where I really like to focus everybody's attention, is the monthly return rates. So again, it's over the last 20 years. Okay, we got the different lines are color coded. So the blue line is just this past year, 2020, and then the purple line. So I'm going to take away everything but those two. If you look at these lines, this is monthly return, meaning it's the indemnity that you were paid over your premium. So what was your return actually? And if you look in the past year, you can see there was pretty good returns if you would have selected coverage in the August, September, October time, May. But what we don't want to get caught up on is the 1 year. Obviously, the more data we have, the better in making decisions. So we look at that 20-year line. The biggest takeaway is that everything is above zero. Okay. And so where we talked about the substantial basis risk, the product isn't perfect. It's not necessarily going to indemnify you every time you have a loss. But what this data shows for this grid, selected it kind of at random, is that in general, what we found is that you're going to experience positive returns with the product. So what we're encourage producers to realize is that it's not perfect at indemnifying when you have a loss, but it is pretty good at providing a return on your investment per se into the insurance product. And what I see here is that it helps me make decisions of when I should insure, what intervals I should be looking at. The highest returns on average over the last 20 years were in May and June, October and November. That's why I selected those as my intervals. I weighted my coverage a little bit more for May and June versus October, November. Then I could go back to my policy and look at what have the historical returns been. And we see that out of the past, let's see here, 11 years, we've had positive returns the vast majority of the time. Okay, we see the gray bars, your total indemnity in 2012. This particular producer insuring this contract would have gotten an indemnity of $3,800. If we cancel out that premium they paid of $577, they would have had a net return of $3,239. And so this is what I guess I would encourage all producers as educators. I would suggest that you get on this tool and get familiar with it. I think it's a phenomenal resource to share with producers that they can quickly go on, identify their grids, look at historic returns. And to me, it makes sense to then be able to tell exactly if this product makes sense for their acreage. So now let me jump back to the slideshow. There we go. So I've demonstrated these. I'll kind of just cruise through them. That was Sevier County that I showed. If we look at Box Elder County, it's the same trend in terms of we rarely see on that purple line, the 20-year trend. There's only one period in April, May that it dipped below zero return. Every other interval, if you select that for coverage, you would expect a positive return. For this Box Elder County, that grid, obviously I would be wanting to select June, July as the coverage interval, as it showed the highest return on average over the 20 years. This was my Sevier County example. San Juan, same thing, that purple line above zero, showing that over the last 20 years, you can be very confident moving forward that that average is going to hold, that in general, you should expect a positive return. So again, these are those historical returns for each of those examples. And now I want to get to a table of results that would show basically how would we expect to fare if we would insure in each of those three counties on average. And let's break that down into a per acre return, per AUM, and per head. And for all of these examples I'm going to be showing, I stuck with the 90% coverage level, 100% productivity factor. We're just using 1,000 acres. And then I selected the two intervals that had the highest average return over the last 20 years for coverage. So as we look at the results table here for our three example counties and grids and Box Elder, Sevier, and San Juan, these are my intervals I selected where I weighted my coverage appropriately. And this column here, return per acre, this is what you could pretty much take to the bank. Again, averages tend to hold true with some obviously variation, but we would think that the just 20-year average is pretty good in terms of what producers would expect in that specific grid, in that county. In the Box Elder grid, we saw a return per acre of 86 cents, Sevier $1.45, San Juan 56 cents. So to quantify that a little more as we think about, I mean, these look like small values in terms of per acres, but as we think about AUMs per acre and then breaking that down into a return per head, it helps us start realizing that this can have a significant impact on this early weaning decision, especially when we consider Dr. Larsen's scenarios that he put up, showing us how much of our variable and fixed costs we'd be covering. These examples demonstrate that we could make a significant dent in some of those negative returns that he was showing using this insurance product. So we took the estimated, again, these are estimates and everybody's situation is going to be different. Every producer is going to recognize how many acres they actually have that are insurable, what their AUMs per acre typically are. But we went ahead and just looked at the Rangeland analysis platform. I put a link here if you're interested in looking at that, where we can get an estimate of production in the different rangelands. And so I took an estimate for these counties and calculated AUMs per acre for each of the three examples. And then based on, if I just said I had a 200 cow calf herd, how many acres would I need? I calculated my total acres here that would be required. And then we're able to multiply the acres times the return per acre to get us a total return for that 200 cow calf operation. So a significant check would be, we would expect, you know, for that Sevier County, over the 20-year average, it's showing us that every year we would expect approximately $10,000 extra dollars in terms of just a return on the PRF insurance. And then a return per AUM of $4.08 up in Box Elder, higher in Sevier, about double that. But this return per head is what I kind of call your attention to in terms of if we remember those values that Dr. Larsen demonstrated, these are going to start to make a significant impact in terms of, we think about if we're going to keep that calf and retain it and invest in some of those preconditioning costs. Yes, it is costly. We're not going to cover our variable costs, but this tool in times of drought can help. And if it comes down to making or breaking that relationship that we have further up the chain with our stalkers and feeders, this is something that we feel is important and could maybe make or break the decision of early weaning, at least in 1 or 2 year drought period.